There is a version of this story that has never been told publicly. Not in any biography, not in any documentary, not in any of the thousands of articles written about James Brown over a career that spanned 5 decades. The version that exists in public is a story about genius, control, and reinvention. It is all of those things. But it is missing the night a man who had dedicated 6 years of his life to the most demanding band leader in the history of American music, sat in a dark hotel room with a tape recorder running and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. And the private conversation that followed, in a small office in Augusta, Georgia, that nobody was supposed to witness. Nobody in that dressing room was supposed to know what Marcus had on that tape. Nobody was supposed to know it existed at all. But secrets have a way of surviving in the music business, and this one nearly destroyed the most complicated friendship in the history of soul music. This is the story of the night James Brown found out, and what he chose to do about it. To understand what happened, you have to go back to 1973, not to a stadium, not to a sold-out arena, but to a tour bus somewhere between Columbus, Ohio and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, at 2:30 in the morning, with the rain hitting the windows and everyone on board too tired to sleep. James Brown's band was exhausted. They had been on the road for 11 months. 11 months of one-nighters, of loading trucks in the dark, of sleeping in seats that weren't made for sleeping, of playing 2-hour shows every single night for a man who never ever slowed down. James demanded perfection in a way that wore people down to the bone. A wrong note wasn't just a mistake, it was a personal offense. A missed cue wasn't an accident, it was disrespect. He fined musicians for being late. He fined them for missing notes. He fined them for sweating on their uniforms in a way he hadn't approved of. The men who played for James Brown were among the greatest musicians alive, and he treated them like they were always one bad night away from being replaced, because they were. Marcus Webb had been with James for 6 years by then. 6 years of playing guitar so precisely, so perfectly, that audiences didn't even notice him, which was exactly the point. James didn't want you to notice his band. He wanted you to notice him. Marcus had accepted that arrangement because the money was good, because the musicianship made him better, and because somewhere underneath all the control and the fury and the unforgiving perfectionism, he genuinely believed that James Brown was the greatest performer alive. He had seen things on that stage that he had never seen anywhere else, things that didn't have names. But 6 years is a long time to swallow your pride, and Marcus Webb had been swallowing his for a long time. The recording happened by accident. That is the one detail that never changed in any version of the story, and it is the detail that makes the whole thing so much more devastating than it might otherwise have been. It was late November, 1973. The tour had just come off a brutal 3-week stretch through the South, and James was in a state that the people closest to him recognized immediately. A state they had learned, over years of proximity, to navigate very carefully. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't eating. He was moving through the world with a kind of controlled intensity that looked from the outside like energy, but felt from the inside like something much more fragile. They were in a hotel in Cincinnati. It was after midnight. Marcus had gone back to his room after the show, but he'd left his portable recorder running on the table. An old U-Her reel-to-reel he used to capture musical ideas before they disappeared. He'd been recording a chord progression he'd come up with during soundcheck and hadn't turned it off. At 12:47 in the morning, he heard the door to the adjoining room. The walls in that hotel were thin in the way that only hotels that have seen too many touring musicians can be. And through those walls, Marcus Webb heard James Brown coming apart. Not in a violent way, not in the way the tabloids would have wanted it. What Marcus heard was something quieter and far more devastating than that. He heard James Brown crying, not performing tears, not the theatrical weeping of a man who had mastered every emotional register for an audience, but the private, ugly, exhausted crying of a person who thought no one could hear. He heard James talking to himself in fragments that didn't connect. He heard him say the name of his mother, who had died when James was young. He heard him say he was tired, not tired in the way you say it when you need a nap. Tired in the way you say it when you have forgotten what rest feels like. Marcus sat completely still for 22 minutes. He did not move toward the recorder to turn it off. He told himself later that he was afraid any noise would alert James through the walls. He told himself he hadn't wanted to embarrass him. Both of those things may have been true. But the recorder kept running, and when it was over, when the sounds from the next room had gone quiet, Marcus sat in the dark and stared at the machine on the table, and understood that he was holding something that could rewrite the entire narrative of James Brown's public life. He told himself he would erase it. He told himself that for 3 months. He did not erase it. By February of 1974, Marcus had begun making quiet inquiries, not to newspapers. He wasn't careless. But there were people in the music industry who collected things. Journalists with reputations for paying well and asking few questions about provenance. Marcus had been careful. He had not given a copy to anyone. He had not played it for anyone. He had simply let it be known, in the elliptical language of a man who is testing the temperature of a room, that he had something unusual, something personal, something that would make people see the godfather of soul differently. The word got back to James Brown on a Tuesday in March. James was in Augusta at his radio station, reviewing ad copy for the afternoon drive. His personal assistant, a woman named Claudette, who had worked for him since 1968 and who James trusted more than almost anyone alive, came into the room and closed the door behind her in a way that told him, before she said a word, that whatever she was about to say was going to require him to sit down. She told him what she'd heard. She told him the name. She told him about the tape. The room was quiet. What happened next is what makes this story something other than a simple betrayal narrative. Because what James Brown did in the hours and days after learning about that tape does not fit the image that most people carry of him. It does not fit the story of the tyrant, the control freak, the man who fined his musicians for sweating. It does not fit any of the easy narratives. He did not call his lawyers first. He did not call the tape a lie. He did not threaten Marcus Webb or have anyone reach out to the people Marcus had been speaking to. He sat in that office in Augusta for a long time, and then he asked Claudette to leave him alone, and he made one phone call. He called Marcus Webb directly. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He said, according to the account that Marcus himself gave years later, in an interview that very few people have read, something that Marcus had not prepared himself to hear. He said, "I know what you have. I need you to come see me. Not come so I can threaten you. Not come so I can explain myself. Just come see me." Marcus Webb drove to Augusta 2 days later. He brought the tape. He sat across from James Brown in a room with no lawyers, no witnesses, no recording equipment that either of them knew about. And James Brown did something that Marcus said he had never, in 6 years, seen him do with anyone. He told the truth. He did not explain away what was on the tape. He did not minimize it or reframe it or perform his way around it. He talked about that night in Cincinnati the way a person talks when they have been carrying something alone for a very long time and have finally found a room where they can set it down. He talked about his mother. He talked about what the road does to a person over decades. He talked about the specific loneliness of being a kind of symbol, of being the thing that other people point to when they want to talk about strength and resilience and survival. When the truth is that strength and resilience and survival have a cost that nobody talks about and nobody sees and nobody is supposed to see. He talked for almost 2 hours. Marcus Webb sat across from him and listened. At the end of it, James Brown looked at Marcus and said something that Marcus quoted almost word for word every time he told this story for the rest of his life. He said, "You can do whatever you want with that tape. I can't stop you, and I'm not going to try. But I want you to know that the person on that tape is the same person sitting across from you right now. And I'm asking you, man to man, to decide what you think that's worth." Marcus Webb never sold the tape. He never played it for anyone. He kept it in a shoebox in his closet in Atlanta for the rest of his life. When he died in 2019, at the age of 74, the tape was still there. His daughter found it. She called a James Brown archivist she found through the James Brown estate, and she asked what she should do with it. The archivist drove to Atlanta the next morning. The tape was never released. That was the decision the estate made, and it was the decision that Marcus had already made 45 years earlier, sitting in a room in Augusta, across from a man who had chosen honesty over self-protection. But here is the part of this story that tends to stop people when they hear it for the first time. Marcus Webb did not quit the band after that conversation. He went back on the road. He played guitar for James Brown for 4 more years until the band reorganized in 1978. And by all accounts, something had shifted between them in a way that neither of them ever fully explained publicly. People who were around during those years described the dynamic differently than the years before. Less like an employer and an employee, more like two people who had seen each other clearly and decided to keep showing up anyway. Claudette, who was still working for James when he died in 2006, said in a private conversation that was later documented by a music historian that James Brown talked about the Marcus situation more than once in his later years. Not as a betrayal he had survived, not as evidence of his own magnanimity, but as the moment he understood something about himself that he had been running from for a long time. He said, Claudette remembered, that he had spent his whole career building a version of himself that nothing could touch. Impenetrable, unstoppable, the hardest working man in show business. He had built that image so well and so completely that he had started to believe it himself. And the night in that Cincinnati hotel room, and then the conversation in Augusta, had cracked that image open in a way that he could not entirely control. And he said, Claudette remembered, that the cracking was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Not because weakness is strength, or any of the other things people say when they want to make suffering sound like a gift, but because James Brown had lived his whole life performing, on stage, off stage, in interviews, in relationships, in every room he ever walked into. And for the first time, in a room with Marcus Webb and a tape recorder and the wreckage of what Marcus had almost done and chosen not to do, James Brown had been seen. Not the image, not the performer, the actual person underneath all of it. He had been seen, and the world had not ended. Marcus Webb had walked into that room with the power to take everything from him, and he had walked out of it with the tape still in his possession and his silence intact. Not because James had bought it or threatened it, because James had trusted him with the truth, because James had extended, to a man who had been on the verge of betraying him, the one thing he almost never extended to anyone. He had trusted him. The shoebox sat in Marcus Webb's closet in Atlanta for 45 years. The tape inside it was never more than a few inches of magnetic ribbon on a plastic spool, but it carried the weight of everything James Brown had ever refused to let anyone see. All the exhaustion, all the grief, all the impossible loneliness of being the symbol of something larger than yourself for your entire adult life. Marcus kept it because James had asked him to think about what it was worth. And Marcus had decided that what it was worth could not be measured in money. It could not be measured in column inches or broadcast minutes or the kind of cultural capital that people in the music industry spent their whole careers accumulating. It was worth something else. Something that didn't have a price tag, because the moment you put a price tag on it, it stopped being what it was. James Brown died on Christmas Day, 2006. Marcus Webb was at his house in Atlanta when he heard the news. He went to the closet. He took out the shoebox. He sat with it for a long time, and then he put it back, exactly where it had always been. Because some things are not ours to give away. Some things are not ours to sell. Some things belong to the person who lived them, even after that person is gone. And the greatest thing Marcus Webb ever did with his guitar was not a riff, not a groove, not a note he played on any stage, in any arena, in any city, on any tour. It was the silence he chose to keep. There is one more thing that needs to be said about all of this. One more piece of the story that tends to get lost in the larger emotional weight of everything else. After James Brown died, after the estate had been settled, and the arguments over his legacy had played out in courts and in magazines and in the long, slow negotiation that always follows the death of a complicated man, a music historian named Robert Pruder spent 3 years interviewing everyone he could find who had worked closely with James during the 1970s. He was writing a chapter about the band, the famous Flames, the JBs, all the iterations of the musicians who had powered James Brown's sound through the decade when that sound was at its most influential. He tracked down former bandmates, roadies, sound engineers, venue managers. He built a picture of what life inside the James Brown organization actually looked like from the inside. He tracked down Marcus Webb in 2009. Marcus was living in a quiet neighborhood in Atlanta, teaching guitar to kids at a community music school. He was 64 years old. He had been retired from professional touring for more than 20 years. He gave Pruder 3 hours. He talked about the music, about the road, about what it meant to be part of something that mattered that much, even when the conditions were as hard as they were. He talked about James with the particular kind of affection that only comes from long experience, not idealization, not resentment, but the clear-eyed appreciation of someone who had seen a person at their worst and their best and had arrived at something resembling understanding. And then, near the end of the interview, Pruder asked Marcus about a rumor he'd heard. A vague story, secondhand, about a tape and a conversation in Augusta. He wasn't even sure the story was real. He mentioned it almost as an afterthought. Marcus Webb was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Yes, it happened." And he told Pruder the story, the real version, from the beginning, without the self-serving edits that most people apply to the difficult chapters of their own lives. He told it the way James had told him his own story that day in Augusta, straight and without performance. Pruder's chapter was never published. The book project fell apart when his publisher folded in 2011. His notes went into storage. The interview with Marcus Webb sat in a box in Chicago for years before a colleague of Pruder's cleaning out a storage unit after Pruder's retirement found the transcripts and understood what they were. That is how this story survived. Not through official channels, not through the gatekeepers of legacy and reputation, but through a cardboard box in a Chicago storage unit and a retired historian's handwritten notes. The same way the tape had survived, in a shoebox, in a closet, held by someone who understood that some things are worth keeping, even when the world has moved on and stopped asking. James Brown spent his entire career insisting on his own invincibility. He performed it so completely and for so long that it became its own kind of truth, a performed truth, which is not the same as the truth, but which has its own weight and its own reality. He built the hardest working man in show business from the ground up, out of poverty and violence and loss and sheer, relentless will. And that construction was not a lie. It was a genuine achievement. But it was also a prison, in the way that every performance eventually becomes a prison if you never take it off. Marcus Webb gave James Brown something that night in Augusta that nobody in his orbit had ever been able to give him. He gave him a witness who chose silence. He gave him the experience of being known, fully, uncomfortably, privately known, and not destroyed by it. He gave him, for one afternoon in a small office in Georgia, the thing that the godfather of soul had been performing around his entire life. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And leave a comment. Have you ever chosen silence when you could have spoken? What did that cost you? We read every single one.